The lecture hall on Epsilon Station buzzed with the kind of intellectual arrogance that could power a small moon. Dr. Kester Van had witnessed this phenomenon across 17 different star systems, and the pattern never failed to amuse her. Take a dozen alien academics, add one primitive human mythology syllabus, and watch them collectively perform mental gymnastics that would make a Hegelian circus troupe weep with envy. As we examine the Terran death-resurrection cycle, Professor Zektar was saying, his mandibles clicking with scholarly authority. We observe the pathological fixation on mortality that characterizes this species' cognitive development. Kester adjusted her position in the back row, notebook balanced on her knee. The Vorthen professor's chitinous exoskeleton gleamed under the lecture hall lights as he gestured toward a holographic display showing crude representations of human religious symbols. The cross, the ankh, various fertility goddesses, all rendered with the aesthetic sensitivity of a medical diagram. Note the recurring theme of sacrificial death, Zektar continued, his compound eyes scanning the room full of nodding graduate students. The human mind appears incapable of processing existential concepts without violent imagery. This suggests a fundamental developmental arrest in their philosophical evolution. A cetacean student, her translation implant rendered the wet clicking as Dr. Reef Song raised a flipper. Professor, couldn't this indicate a sophisticated understanding of transformation through adversity? Zektar's antennae twitched dismissively. My dear Reef Song, you're anthropomorphizing. What appears to be sophistication is merely a species-wide trauma response. Humans literalize metaphorical concepts because they lack the cognitive architecture for abstract reasoning. Kester bit her lip to suppress a snort. The irony was so thick she could have served it at a diplomatic banquet. Here sat beings who required technological augmentation, just a dream, lecturing about a species that had been crafting complex psychological allegories since before they'd invented the wheel. But Professor interjected MX, Quantum 6, their crystalline form refracting the hologram into prismatic fragments. Human mythological systems demonstrate remarkable consistency across isolated populations. Doesn't this suggest some form of collective unconscious rather than primitive fixation? Parallel evolution of neurosis, Zektar replied with the confidence of someone who had never actually read Jung. When a species develops under constant predation pressure, similar psychological pathologies emerge independently. It's quite predictable, really. The discussion continued with the measured pace of academic discourse, each alien professor building upon the foundation of human intellectual inadequacy with the methodical precision of architects constructing a monument to their own assumptions. Dr. Helix Prime, the Saurian visiting lecturer, added her expertise on primitive symbolic thinking. Consider their flood narratives, Helix Prime hissed, her reptilian features animated with scholarly enthusiasm. Sumerian, Hebrew, Hindu, Aboriginal Australian, all describe global cleansing events. Rather than sophisticated metaphors for psychological renewal, these represent literal interpretations of seasonal flooding patterns. The human mind simply cannot distinguish between physical and metaphysical reality. Fascinating, murmured Professor Void Whisper, the umbral delegate whose species communicated through controlled manipulation of dark matter. On my home world, we've developed recreational simulations of human mythological thinking. It's quite quaint, like watching infant larvae attempt complex mathematics. The assembled academics chuckled with the refined cruelty that only tenured professors could achieve. Kester made another note, her pen moving with practiced efficiency. The anthropological gold mine these creatures were providing would fuel her research for decades. Now, let's examine their hero cycles, Zektar announced, the hologram shifting to display images of various mythological figures. Gilgamesh, Perseus, Quetzalcoatl, King Arthur, all variations on the same psychological template. The human need to project individual agency onto cosmic forces reveals their inability to accept existential meaninglessness. Dr. Reef-Song clicked thoughtfully. But surely the universality of these patterns suggests something more profound than mere psychological compensation? Convergent neurosis, replied Helix Prime before Zektar could respond. When you examine human neural architecture, you find remarkable uniformity in their emotional processing centers. They're essentially running the same primitive software with minor regional variations. Kestra raised her hand. The motion felt surreal. A xenomythologist with 3 advanced degrees and 14 published papers asking permission to speak in a freshman-level misinterpretation of her life's work. Yes, miss? Zektar's compound eyes focused on her with the patient condescension reserved for audit students. Dr. Van, she said quietly, I was wondering about the methodology here. When you analyze these mythological systems, are you examining them within their original cultural context, or are you applying external interpretive frameworks? A brief silence settled over the lecture hall. Several students turned to stare at the human, who had dared to question the scholarly approach. Zektar's mandibles clicked in what his species considered a scholarly smile. My dear Dr. Van, that's precisely the kind of thinking that demonstrates the limitations I've been describing. Humans consistently overestimate the sophistication of their own cultural products. What you call context is simply elaborate rationalization for fundamentally primitive impulses. I see, Kestra replied, making another note. So you're suggesting that external analysis provides more accurate interpretation than indigenous understanding? Precisely, Helix Prime interjected with evident delight. When studying any primitive culture, objective distance is essential. The subjects themselves are too embedded in their own cognitive limitations to provide reliable analysis. Professor Void Whisper's dark matter tendrils pulsed approvingly. It's rather like asking a virus to explain epidemiology. The phenomenon lacks the perspective necessary for genuine comprehension. The comparison drew appreciative chuckles from the graduate students. Kestra nodded thoughtfully, her pen moving across the page with increasing speed. That's a fascinating perspective, she said. I'm curious about the comparative methodology. Have you applied similar analytical frameworks to, say, Vorthan ancestor memory cycles or Saurian territorial bonding rituals? Zektar's antennae stiffened slightly. That's entirely different. Our cultural practices represent evolved responses to genuine environmental challenges. Human mythology is pure fantasy displacement. Ah, Kestra said, her voice carefully neutral. So the methodology changes based on the species being studied? Not the methodology. Helix Prime clarified with growing irritation. The subject matter's fundamental nature. When you're dealing with genuinely sophisticated civilizations, you must account for actual complexity. Human mythological thinking lacks such complexity. Kestra made one final note and closed her notebook. The lecture continued for another 30 minutes, with the alien academics constructing increasingly elaborate theories about human psychological primitiveness, each building upon the last like a tower of intellectual playing cards. As the session concluded and students began filing out, chattering about the fascinating insights into human cognitive limitations, Kestra remained seated. She watched the professors gather their materials, still discussing the amusing naivety of human mythological thinking. What they didn't know, what none of them suspected as they congratulated themselves on their analytical superiority, was that the quiet human in the back row had been taking notes for an entirely different purpose. Each dismissive comment, every confident misinterpretation, every assumption about human intellectual inadequacy was being carefully documented, not because she disagreed with their conclusions, but because she was building a case study in academic blind spots that would revolutionize galactic anthropological methodology forever. The real examination had only just begun. 3 days later, Kestra returned to Advanced Xenosociology 447, this time arriving early enough to claim a seat in the middle section. Today's topic, according to the syllabus projected on the wall, was Comparative Analysis of Terran Symbolic Death Rituals. The subtitle read, Why Humans Can't Let Go. Professor Zektar began with characteristic confidence. Today we'll explore the psychological compulsions underlying human mourning practices. Notice how they consistently anthropomorphize abstract concepts. Death becomes a person, fate becomes a weaver, time becomes a devourer. This literalization reveals their inability to process metaphysical concepts directly. Dr. Reef Song's translation unit bubbled softly as she spoke. Professor, I've been reviewing additional materials since our last session. The Tibetan Bardo, Thodol, presents remarkably sophisticated psychological mapping of consciousness states during transition periods. Could this suggest? Ah, yes, Zektar interrupted, his compound eyes gleaming. The so-called Book of the Dead. A perfect example of elaborate wishful thinking masquerading as spiritual insight. Humans fear extinction so profoundly that they constructed detailed fantasies about consciousness persistence. Kestra leaned forward slightly. Dr. Zektar, have you examined the neurological correlates described in these texts? The Bardo system maps specific brain states that correspond remarkably well to what your own species scientists have identified in transition state consciousness research. The lecture hall fell quiet. Several students turned to look at her again, the persistent human with uncomfortable questions. Miss Van, Zektar's mandibles clicked impatiently. You're conflating coincidental overlap with intentional scientific observation. Humans stumbled onto crude approximations of concepts we developed through rigorous methodology. Stumbled, Kestra repeated, her tone thoughtful. That's interesting phrasing. Professor Helix Prime, when your species developed a territorial bonding codex, did you stumble onto those insights, or were they the result of systematic cultural evolution over millennia? Helix Prime's scales ripple with annoyance. Our cultural practices emerged through intelligent adaptation to environmental pressures. We consciously refined our understanding through generations of deliberate development. Fascinating, Kestra said, opening her notebook. So that when humans independently develop meditation techniques that produce measurable alterations in brainwave patterns, techniques that predate your species' discovery of consciousness state manipulation by several thousand years, this represents accidental stumbling rather than intelligent adaptation? Professor Void Whisper's dark matter field fluctuated with what the translation matrix rendered as academic superiority. The comparison is invalid. Our methods are technologically verified. Human practices are based on superstition and subjective experience. I see, Kestra replied, making rapid notes. So empirical verification is a distinguishing factor. Tell me, how do you empirically verify the effectiveness of your own species' ancestor memory integration rituals, the ones that form the foundation of Umbral social structure? The question hung in the air like a challenge thrown down at a diplomatic reception. Void Whisper's field darkened noticeably. Our practices are culturally validated through collective experience and generational refinement. Ah, Kestra said with dangerous gentleness. Subjective experience verified through cultural consensus. That sounds remarkably similar to how human mythological systems developed and persisted. What makes one approach superstition and the other culturally validated? Dr. Reef Song clicked excitedly. That's actually a profound methodological question. If we apply the same analytical framework to all species' cultural practices, we are not applying the same framework. Zektar cut her off sharply, because the cognitive capabilities are fundamentally different. Humans lack the intellectual architecture for genuine philosophical abstraction. Kestra closed her notebook and looked directly at the Vorthan professor. Dr. Zektar, I'm curious about something. Your species' greatest philosophical work, the Mandible Meditations, explores the relationship between individual consciousness and cosmic order through elaborate metaphorical constructs involving predator-prey dynamics. Correct? That is a gross oversimplification of. Please bear with me, Kessler interrupted smoothly. Your philosophical tradition uses hunting metaphors to explore existential questions because your species evolved as apex predators. The metaphorical framework emerges from your biological and cultural experience, yes? Zektar's antennae twitched uncertainly. The mandible meditations transcend mere biological metaphor through sophisticated abstract reasoning. Absolutely, Kessler agreed. They take your species' fundamental experiences and transform them into universal philosophical insights. That's precisely what human mythology does. The difference is that you're calling your species' approach sophisticated abstraction and ours primitive literalization, despite the identical underlying process. The lecture hall had grown uncomfortably quiet. Even the environmental systems seemed to be holding their mechanical breath. Helix Prime scales flushed with academic indignation. The comparison is absurd. Our philosophical traditions are based on rational analysis of observable phenomena, like the Saurian egg wisdom texts. Kestra asked conversationally, the ones that describe cosmic creation through elaborate reproductive metaphors? I've always found it remarkable how your species' creation mythology, philosophical cosmology, mirrors your own reproductive cycle so precisely. Shell breaking as dimensional transition, nest warmth as universal energy, parental feeding as the flow of knowledge from teacher to student. Those are profound insights into nature reality. Helix Prime hissed defensively, not mere biological projection. I completely agree, Kestra said. Her voice wore with apparent sincerity. They're brilliant philosophical frameworks that use familiar biological experiences to explore cosmic principles. Just like human flood narratives use familiar environmental experiences to explore psychological renewal, or resurrection myths use familiar life cycles to explore transformation and growth. Professor Void Whisper's field pulsed with growing agitation. You're conflating sophisticated philosophical inquiry with primitive pattern matching. Am I? Kestra asked, genuinely curious. Professor, your species' signature contribution to galactic philosophy is the void paradox, the idea that consciousness emerges from the spaces between thoughts rather than the thoughts themselves. That's a profound insight that emerges directly from your species' unique ability to manipulate dark matter, isn't it? The metaphysical principle grows out of your physical capabilities. The void paradox is not mere metaphor, Void Whisper replied. The translation matrix struggling with the intensity of the dark matter fluctuations. It represents genuine insight into the nature of consciousness itself. Exactly, Kestra said with enthusiasm that sounded entirely genuine. It's a universal truth discovered through your species' particular perspective and capabilities. Which brings me back to my original question about methodology. She opened her notebook again, pen poised. If every species' greatest philosophical insights emerge from their particular biological, environmental, and cultural experiences, why are human mythological systems dismissed as primitive while everyone else's are celebrated as sophisticated philosophy? The question landed in the lecture hall, like a small theological bomb. Students exchanged uncertain glances. The professor sat in the kind of silence that academic careers are built on avoiding. Finally, Dr. Reef-Song's clicking filled the void. That's actually a very good point. If we applied the same analytical standards. We are not applying the same standards, Zektar snapped, his scholarly composure cracking like ice on a warming planet, because humans demonstrably lack the cognitive sophistication to do what? Kestra asked quietly. To create philosophical frameworks that have guided billions of individuals through existential crises for thousands of years? to develop psychological models that your own graduate students are now studying in advanced consciousness courses, to construct narrative systems so robust that they continue generating new insights after millennia of analysis. She paused, looking around the lecture hall with the expression of someone discovering something fascinating. I'm beginning to think the methodology problem might be more complex than initially apparent. The following week's seminar had been hastily retitled Emergent Consciousness in Pre-Contact Civilizations, a Reassessment. Kestra noted with amusement that attendance had doubled. Word traveled fast in academic circles, especially when someone started poking holes in established theoretical frameworks. Professor Zektar entered the lecture hall with the careful dignity of someone whose intellectual territory had been invaded by barbarians armed with inconvenient logic. Behind him trailed Dr. Zenithval, a renowned crystalline consciousness researcher whose presence suggested this had escalated beyond simple classroom discourse. Today we'll examine the question Dr. Van raised regarding methodological consistency, Zektar announced, his mandibles clicking with forced academic neutrality. Dr. Zenithval has graciously agreed to provide additional perspective on consciousness development patterns. The crystalline entity's faceted form caught and refracted the lecture hall lights into prismatic patterns that served as their species' equivalent of nervous fidgeting. Thank you, Professor. I've been reviewing the materials discussed in your previous sessions, and I must admit to some intriguing observations. Kestra settled back in her chair, pen ready. This was going to be interesting. Dr. Zenithval. Dr. Reef Song began tentatively. In your research on consciousness emergence, have you identified any patterns that might shed light on this debate? The crystalline's internal luminescence pulsed thoughtfully. Indeed, what we observe across all species is that consciousness develops sophisticated frameworks for processing existential uncertainty. Each species creates conceptual tools appropriate to their cognitive architecture and environmental pressures. Exactly, Helix Prime interjected, her scales brightening with renewed confidence, which is why human approaches remain fundamentally limited by their biological constraints. Actually, Zenithval said, their crystalline structure is shifting slightly. That's where the data becomes problematic for our current theoretical models. The lecture hall fell silent with the kind of academic tension that preceded either breakthroughs or career-ending revelations. Problematic how? Zektar asked carefully. Zenithval's prismatic form rotated slowly, casting rainbow patterns across the walls. Human consciousness development displays characteristics we typically associate with much more advanced cognitive architectures. They've developed what we might call organic complexity algorithms, narrative structures that process multiple layers of meaning simultaneously. Professor Void Whisper's dark matter field contracted sharply. Surely you're not suggesting that accidental pattern matching represents genuine algorithmic sophistication? I'm suggesting that the distinction between accidental and intentional may be less relevant than we assumed, Zenithval replied. Consider the human concept of sacrifice in their mythological systems. What we've been interpreting as morbid fixation actually represents a sophisticated cost-benefit analysis framework applied to abstract values. Kestra found herself leaning forward despite her intention to remain observational. This was veering into territory she hadn't expected a crystalline consciousness researcher to explore. Elaborate, Zektar said, though his tone suggested he really didn't want the elaboration. Human sacrifice narratives consistently explore the mathematical relationship between immediate loss and systemic gain. Zenithval continued, their internal light pulsing with the rhythm of complex calculations. Abraham and Isaac, Prometheus stealing fire, Jesus dying for humanity's sins, even secular variations like soldiers dying for their comrades, all represent sophisticated modeling of value exchanges across different temporal and social scales. Dr. Reef Song clicked with sudden understanding. They're running cost-benefit analyses on abstract concepts like honor, love, and meaning itself. Precisely, Zenith Val confirmed. What we interpreted as primitive death obsession is actually advanced value calculation methodology. They're computing the exchange rates between intangible assets in ways that required our species to develop quantum processing systems to achieve. Helix Prime scales have begun the slow flush that indicated deep cognitive discomfort, but their methods are entirely intuitive. They're not consciously applying mathematical principles. Neither are you when you perform territorial bonding calculations, Kestra said quietly. Your species instinctively evaluates complex social hierarchies and resource allocation patterns without conscious mathematical awareness. You simply externalize the same processes into technological systems. Zenith Val's prismatic structure brightened with what appeared to be excitement. Dr. Van raises a crucial point. Human consciousness appears to have developed integrated processing capabilities that most species require external technological augmentation to achieve. Professor Void Whisper's field darkened ominously. Are you seriously suggesting that humans are more cognitively advanced than established galactic civilizations? I'm suggesting that our definition of advanced may be biased toward externalized, technologically mediated capabilities. Zenith Val replied. Humans have developed internal processing systems that achieve similar results through different mechanisms. Zektar's compound eyes fixed on Kestra with growing suspicion. Dr. Van, you seem remarkably well-informed about consciousness development theory for someone auditing introductory courses. Kestra met his gaze steadily. I find the subject fascinating. Tell me, Dr. Zenith Val, in your research, have you encountered other examples of integrated organic processing that challenge our assumptions about cognitive development? The crystalline entity's form shifted through several configurations before settling into what their species used to indicate deep contemplation. Human linguistic development presents another anomaly. They have created communication systems that operate simultaneously on literal, metaphorical, emotional, and social levels. Most species require separate cognitive modules for each type of information processing. Their poetry, Dr. Reefsong said suddenly, her clicking accelerating with realization. Human poetry processes semantic meaning, emotional resonance, cultural context, and aesthetic pattern recognition simultaneously. We need 4 different analytical frameworks to comprehend what they create instinctively. Precisely, Zenith Val confirmed. What we've been dismissing as primitive artistic expression represents integrated multidimensional communication that our most advanced artificial intelligence systems struggle to replicate. The implications began settling over the lecture hall like a slow-acting philosophical poison. If humans possess naturally integrated cognitive capabilities that other species achieved only through technological augmentation, then the entire theoretical framework for ranking civilizational advancement required fundamental revision. Helix Prime made a sound that the translation matrix rendered as academic distress. This is impossible. Humans are demonstrably less technologically advanced than any galactic civilization. Are they? Kestra asked with genuine curiosity. Or have they simply developed along different optimization paths? Your species achieved interstellar travel by creating external technologies that replicate the capabilities humans developed internally. Different solutions to the same evolutionary challenges. Professor Void Whisper's field pulsed with what might have been panic. If this analysis is correct, then our entire understanding of consciousness development will require complete theoretical reconstruction. Zenith Val finished. Yes, the implications are quite staggering. Zektar sat in silence for several long moments, his antennae twitching with the complex calculations that his species performed when confronting paradigm-shifting information. Finally, he spoke. Dr. Van, I'm curious. How exactly did you develop such sophisticated insights into consciousness development theory? Kestra smiled, closing her notebook with a soft snap that seemed to echo through the suddenly quiet lecture hall. Well, Professor, that's an excellent question. Perhaps we should explore it in next week's session. She gathered her materials and headed for the exit, leaving behind a room full of academics who were beginning to suspect that their understanding of human cognitive development might be as primitive as they'd once believed human mythology to be. The real education was just beginning. The final session drew an audience that spilled beyond the lecture hall's capacity. Word had spread to the academic networks like a virus designed specifically to infect tenure-track egos. Distinguished professors from 17 different departments had materialized, along with graduate students who sensed the kind of paradigm shift that launched careers or destroyed them. Kestra arrived to find her usual seat occupied by Dr. Helix Kethmun, the station's dean of xenobiological studies. She chose a position near the front instead, which seemed to make several faculty members visibly uncomfortable. Professor Zektar had clearly spent the week preparing for intellectual warfare. His mandibles gleamed with fresh polish, and he'd arranged his materials with precision of someone about to defend his life's work. "Before we begin today's discussion," he announced, "I believe Dr. Van owes academic community some clarification regarding her background and qualifications." The challenge hung in the air like a formal academic duel. Kestra stood slowly, turned to face the assembled crowd of galactic intelligentsia who had come to witness either her humiliation or their own theoretical demolition. "Certainly, Professor. Though I should mention that I've been conducting field research here for the past 18 months. Dr. Reef Song's clicking faltered mid-rhythm. Field research? On academic bias and xenoanthropological methodology, Kestra continued conversationally. Specifically, how cognitive supremacy assumptions affect interpretive frameworks when studying pre-contact civilizations. The lecture hall's environmental systems seemed to wheeze with collective academic anxiety. Dean Kethmun leaned forward, his crest feathers ruffling with what his species displayed during moments of intellectual predation. "Dr. Van," he said with carefully controlled authority, "are you suggesting that you've been deliberately manipulating our academic discourse for research purposes?" "Not manipulating," Kestra corrected gently. "Documenting. I've attended similar seminars on 43 different stations across 7 sectors. The patterns are remarkably consistent." She pulled out a data tablet and activated a holographic display that filled the lecture hall with floating charts, graphs, and statistical analyses. Across all surveyed institutions, human cultural products are consistently evaluated using different methodological standards than those applied to local civilizations. Faculty demonstrate systematic interpretation bias when analyzing human mythological, philosophical, and artistic traditions. Professor Void Whisper's dark matter field contracted into what their species used to signal territorial threat. "You've been studying us like laboratory specimens." "I've been studying academic methodology," Kestra replied. "The fact that you feel like specimens might be worth examining." Dr. Zenith Val's crystalline structure brightened with what appeared to be delight. "Fascinating. Dr. Van, what conclusions has your research yielded?" Kestra manipulated the holographic display, highlighting specific data clusters. "Galactic academic institutions consistently underestimate human cognitive capabilities by an average factor of 4.7. This bias correlates directly with institutional distance from Earth and inversely with faculty exposure to human cultural products in their original contexts." The numbers floated in the air like accusations made of light and mathematics. Dean Kethmun's crest feathers had begun the aggressive display pattern that indicated serious professional threat assessment. "These findings would suggest," he said carefully, "that our entire academic establishment has been operating under flawed assumptions." "Not flawed," Kestra said with precision of someone who had spent months crafting this moment. "Incomplete. Your analytical frameworks are sophisticated and effective when applied consistently. The problem arises when different species receive different methodological treatment." She gestured toward a particularly damning statistical cluster. For instance, when analyzing creation mythologies, faculty consistently interpret alien frameworks as sophisticated philosophical systems, while categorizing structurally identical human narratives as primitive wishful thinking. Helix prime scales have flushed through 3 different color phases, finally settling on the model pattern her species displayed during cognitive restructuring periods. But the technological development gaps between humans and galactic civilizations are undeniable. Absolutely, Kester agreed. Humans developed along different optimization paths. The question is whether technological advancement represents the only valid measure of intellectual sophistication. She manipulated the display again, revealing a complex 3-dimensional model. Human civilizations invested cognitive resources in developing integrated consciousness processing systems rather than external technological augmentation. Different solutions, comparable effectiveness. Professor Zektar sat in the kind of silence that preceded either profound intellectual breakthrough or complete professional breakdown. His compound eyes tracked the floating data with mechanical precision. "Dr. Van," he said finally, "what exactly is your academic specialty?" Kester smiled, and for the first time since entering the lecture hall 6 weeks ago, she allowed her full professional credentials to show in her posture and expression. Comparative xenomythology with a specialization in cognitive bias analysis. I hold advanced degrees from the Terran Institute for Consciousness Studies, the Centauri Collective for Advanced Philosophy, and the Rigel Academy for Interspecies Psychological Research. My current project involves documenting systematic interpretation biases in galactic academic institutions. The lecture hall fell silent with the weight of collective realization. The human they'd been condescending to for weeks was arguably the most qualified person in the room to discuss the very subjects they'd been lecturing about. The working title of my upcoming publication, Kester continued, is The Student Fallacy: How Academic Supremacy Assumptions Corrupt Xenoanthropological Methodology. It will feature detailed case studies from this institution, along with 42 others. Dean Kethmun's crest feathers had flattened completely against his skull. "Dr. Van, surely academic courtesy would suggest applying consistent methodological standards regardless of species origin," Kester interrupted smoothly, "something this institution might consider implementing." Dr. Zenithval's prismatic form rotated with what appeared to be profound amusement. "Dr. Van, I believe I speak for many of us when I say that your research has provided exactly the kind of analytical framework we need to advance xenoanthropological studies." "Thank you, Dr. Zenithval. Though I should mention that the real breakthrough came from your willingness to question established assumptions. Critical thinking remains a foundation of genuine scholarship, regardless of species." Professor Zektar finally spoke, his voice carrying the hollow quality of someone whose worldview had just been systematically deconstructed by its intended victim. "So, while we were treating you like a student, you were actually grading your examination," Kester finished. "And I'm afraid the results suggest that galactic academia might benefit from some remedial coursework in basic methodological consistency." She began packing her materials, the simple gesture somehow carrying the authority of someone who had just revolutionized an entire academic field through strategic patience. "My research proposal for next semester involves a collaborative project between human and galactic scholars to develop genuinely inclusive analytical frameworks. Anyone interested in actual academic advancement rather than species-based intellectual superiority is welcome to participate." As she headed toward the exit, Kester paused near Professor Zektar's lectern. "By the way, Professor, your mandible meditations really are brilliant philosophical works. You should consider analyzing them using the same generous interpretive frameworks you apply to human mythology. You might discover that wisdom and sophistication aren't distributed according to technological development timelines." The lecture hall remained silent long after she'd gone, filled with academics who were beginning to understand that their assumptions about intellectual hierarchy had been as mythological as any story humans had ever created. The difference was that human myths generally taught useful lessons about the dangers of hubris. Academic myths, apparently, just perpetuated it.